The fun thing about history is that it's already happened, so we can look back at the things we've done and say, oh man, yeah, those 6 hours on bath salts were probably a bad idea, or heck yeah, that time at the beach was a lot of fun, let's make sure to do that again soon. Well, one little footnote in American history wasn't nearly as much fun as a day at the beach, and it was called the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Act created tariffs on U.S. trading partners that economists and historians agree made the Depression much worse. The stupidest thing about history is that even though it's right there in front of us, practically nobody cares, so we just do the same dumb things over and over. So let's talk about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs to find out what's in store for America now that we're doing it all over again. I'm Kevin Lankus, and I'm your host for the Great Depression after the Great Depression after the one before that. Wow, I get it. Is that what's gonna be so great about America now? Fun fact, there was actually a Great Depression before the Great Depression we all know. What we now call the Panic of 1893 was once known as the Great Depression, and that was before an even greater depression captured our hearts and minds and became the economic downturn we all know and love. And that big one began with the stock market crash of October 1829. Black Thursday, as it was called, brought all of the reckless speculating and rampant economic growth of the Roaring Twenties to an immediate halt. Combined with low consumer spending and fears of a bubble economy, a massive sell-off of 12.9 million shares became a trading record. That is, until Black Tuesday, when a further 16 million shares were sold off, many of them for practically nothing. And then big business interests and Republican politicians did what they do best, which is work really hard to make everything a whole lot worse. President Herbert Hoover had been elected with much the same vibe behind him as Trump was. He was said to be the business-savvy, pro-economy president of the time, and unlike Trump, Hoover was actually a decent businessman, and he didn't inherit $400 million from his dad that he squandered, but he was actually genuinely self-made. However, he was still a big business guy, so despite all the academics and historians and over 1,000 economists who study these things telling him to veto the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, of course he signed it instead. So what was this thing, and why was it bad? Also, first off, what the fuck is a tariff? Because honestly, much like the word sheriff, I can't ever figure out if it's supposed to be 2 R's or 2 F's, but in this case, we're definitely getting double F'd, so it's actually pretty easy to remember. Tariff is a tax on imports from trade partners. Tariffs can be known as import duties, custom duties, import taxes, and tariff taxes. Before income tax became a thing, tariffs were a major source of revenue for the United States. They also helped at various points to beef up domestic industry by favoring products made here and discouraging people from buying foreign-made goods. A tariff is a restriction on the free market that attempts to control external variables and prop up domestic businesses. And you may wonder why the so-called free market capitalists of the Republican Party are all so invested in placing restrictions and rules on the free market, and you'd be right to wonder about that. And they also desperately do not want you to think of tariffs as taxes, even though that's absolutely what they are. That's the definition of tariffs. They're taxes on foreign companies that then get passed on to consumers because of the price of imported goods rising as a result of enacting them. Back in 1922, an act of Congress raised the average tariff on imported goods to around 40%. So that was the rate going into the new economic downturn. Moderate Republicans actually did shut down the first attempt to pass the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1929, but then the stock market crashed, and the fear-driven reactionary proto-MAGA Republicans won over the rest, and Smoot-Hawley went through. And it was named after the sponsors, Senator Reed Owen Smoot, a Republican from Utah, and Representative Willis Chapman Hawley, a Republican from Oregon. And when it passed in 1930, it added another 20% on top of the already 40% tariff rates on certain categories of foreign goods. Now, the focus began with agriculture in an attempt to protect American farmers, but then the toothpaste was out of the tube and there was no putting it back. So other interest groups from other sectors began to demand reactionary tariffs on their foreign competition as well. The global implications of this were massive and immediate. At home in the US, you had everyday consumers who were already struggling and spending less and less all the time, who were now faced with increasing prices on goods across a number of categories. So things that were already unaffordable became practically impossible to get their hands on, and the flow of money domestically basically just stopped. And everybody else around the world was in a similar position, or worse. Consider Germany, a country that was struggling to pay war reparations from World War I. Well, one major way they were doing that, since their post-war economy was crippled, was to attempt to raise that money through exports. So it's kind of like if you buy a friend a beer at the bar and he's already hurting because he's out of work, but instead of taking it easy and being chill about it, you decide to make him pay you back 60% more for that beer and then every beer after. Pretty soon nobody's going to want to drink with you. And that's exactly what happened during the Great Depression because of Smoot-Hawley. Everybody in the bar turned to America and said, "Get the out." U.S. trade partners retaliated immediately, and for 5 whole years after this horrendous policy decision, global trade dropped by 66%, just further plunging everybody into the shit. This was part of the reason that Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the election in 1932 and absolutely trounced Hoover's re-election bid. As is tradition, we stupidly elect the so-called pro-business candidate and then have to elect a Democrat to fix the absolute dumpster fire they created while in office. And this is all happening again right now. Instead of softening things and propping up and strengthening the economy like FDR did, we're going the Hoover route and deciding to double down on dumbassery and completely disrupt global trade by enacting isolationist tariffs and crashing the stock market. Trump has enacted the most severe and wide-ranging tariff seen for 100 years, in a time when every economist alive says that tariffs are pretty much a universally stupid policy. Just so much winning. It took 10 years and World War II, a massive global conflict that skyrocketed domestic production and industry, to drag America out of the Great Depression. But this isn't the 1940s anymore, and we don't have that kind of potentiality to count on. Wars and economies are vastly different these days, so it's pretty hard to say what might get us out of the mess that's about to hit us this time. Of course, the one thing we know for sure is that not being in this situation in the first place would have been a great start. So this may be the one and only case where Republican policy about abstinence is actually correct. Even Ronald Reagan came out to say that Smoot-Hawley was a dumb thing to do. In a 1986 radio interview, he said that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff ignited an international trade war and helped sink our country into the Great Depression. And that's where we are now, trying to avoid another Great Depression that'll take the place of the last one, just like the 1930s replaced the Panic of 1893. All we can do right now is just try to keep our heads up as the basic everyday system of buying and selling collapses around us, and come together as a community to stay afloat and weather the storm as the big boats of industry make tsunamis for us as they soar through the seas and drag us back to the days of collapsing empires. And watch how history repeats itself as human beings flail desperately against the currents off into the past.